in the new government, the newly appointed government, in an attempt to rally support for Papandreou's policy and austerity, as agreed with his international creditors.
Well, despite the popular anger, Greece's finance minister today vowed to push ahead with austerity efforts. Attending a Eurozone meeting in Luxembourg, he said Athens could still achieve its debt reduction targets. The EU has laid that out as a condition to pay Greece the last instalment of last year's bailout package. Let's listen to the Greek finance minister speaking in Luxembourg earlier this Sunday.
The country needs to be saved, and it will be saved. It must regain its dignity. It must recover its national and economic domination. It must exit this turbulence. All Greeks together must fight to take our heads out of the water and take a breath.
People in Spain also vented their anger at bleak economic prospects. Tens of thousands converged onto the Parliament building in Madrid to denounce the high unemployment and the corruption rife in Spain's political class. The protest was part of the Indignant movement, which has organised sit-ins and rallies for weeks now. Similar demonstrations were held in other cities, including Barcelona, Valencia and Seville.
Athens to protest at the prospect of further budget cuts. It comes as the Greek Prime Minister appealed for national unity, warning that the country risks defaulting on its debt unless a series of new austerity measures are pushed through Parliament. Our Europe editor, Gavin Hewitt, reports from Athens.
Once again, thousands gathered outside the Greek Parliament tonight. Thieves, thieves, they shouted at the building. They also chanted, "We won't pay, we won't pay," defiantly resisting further austerity measures in exchange for funds from the EU and IMF. Lines of police protected the Parliament. Inside, the Prime Minister, George Papandreou, facing a confidence vote, said Greece was at a crossroads and its cash reserves would soon be exhausted. The consequences of a violent bankruptcy or exit from the euro, the Prime Minister said, would be immediately catastrophic for households, the banks and the country's credibility. The crowds heard that the Prime Minister is negotiating a second bailout close to 110 billion euros, but that will depend on Greece accepting a new austerity package. The government is looking to save 28 billion euros through tax increases and spending cuts. A further 50 billion will be raised by selling off state assets, and there's to be a 20% cut in civil service numbers. But there are many, like the Sari Giannopoulos family, who are already facing unemployment, who say they just can't cope with further cutbacks.
You know, our main responsibilities are our families at this moment. And you know, we are going to be in a situation where we won't be able to meet those responsibilities. I'm just devastated. I don't see a future. I don't see a future for myself, and especially for my children.
A poll today suggested that nearly half of Greeks won't accept more austerity, even with the threat of bankruptcy.
Away from here, but watching very closely, Eurozone finance ministers have begun meeting in Luxembourg. They're set to release more funds to stave off an immediate default. They will also discuss a second Greek bailout.
The new Greek finance minister promised the meeting that austerity reforms would be implemented.
We can achieve our target thanks to the efforts of our people.
But new European loans are dependent on Greece fulfilling its commitments, and that can't be guaranteed. This was the scene outside Parliament late tonight. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Athens.
So return now to our main story in those civilian casualties.
Potentially of that scale, if not bigger. So everyone knows that actually the easiest thing to do, it may be very annoying for the German taxpayer, is to give the Greeks the money and, you know, hope for the best.
Ordinary taxpayers don't understand why banks can't share the pain, but asking them to do so, some warn, risks a repeat of the very crisis this process is trying to prevent. Tygan Wright, Sky News, Brussels.
In a fresh bid to tackle the problem of runaway dads, David Cameron has declared that absent fathers should be stigmatised by society, just like
in the Eurogroup, in my new capacity as the Greek Minister of Finance, is a great opportunity for me to repeat the strong commitment of the Greek government and the strong will of the Greek people for the implementation of the program. We can achieve our target thanks to the efforts of our people and thanks to the cooperation and the assistance of our partners. Thank you very much.
Well, meanwhile, the protesters in Greece say they will carry on demonstrating until the government eases the austerity measures put in place to tackle the debt burden. From Athens, Tim Friend sent this report.
The 29th consecutive day of protest. The square outside the Greek parliament is never empty these days. As the austerity measures bite deeper and deeper, more and more people come out onto the streets.
Behind the peaceful fringes of this big demonstration is real anger. Just a few hours ago, the Prime Minister asked for national unity, but he's certainly not going to get it from these demonstrators.
Many want a referendum now on the legality of the bailout conditions.
The referendum must happen now, not on September or October or wherever the Prime Minister wants, because there are very serious issues that we must decide now.
Earlier in Parliament, Mr. Papandreou insisted that his was the only route to salvation. More austerity, the only answer.
The consequences of a violent bankruptcy or exit from the euro would be immediate, catastrophic for Greek families, banks and the credibility of our country, and would have put us back where we started.
The main opposition will try to bring down the Prime Minister when the confidence vote comes on Tuesday night.
We will not give you our vote, Mr. Papandreou, for one simple reason, because your government insists on a policy that not only fails to solve the problem, but makes it worse and creates more problems.
The protesters claim they are now under economic occupation by the International Monetary Fund, but a viable alternative policy is still hazy.
And Tim could join us live now from Athens. Tim, give us an idea of just how big this latest demonstration was.
Well, several thousand people, some estimates say about 10,000 people, in front of the Parliament building here in central Athens. They started gathering not long after that first day's debate on this confidence motion, which will go on until midnight Tuesday when they have the vote. It was big and it was peaceful, unlike the one last week which saw violence erupt here on the streets, lots of tear gas being used to try and disperse the demonstrators. For the moment it's been peaceful again. They've started to disperse now. The speeches are still going on to the hardcore of demonstrators who on some nights have been staying all night here in the main square. But I think there's a sense of frustration alongside their anger as well, because they realise, although they may not like to admit it, that really all the big decisions aren't being made here in Greece anymore. And it really wouldn't matter who the Prime Minister was at the moment, because it's the International Monetary Fund and the other members of the Eurozone who are really calling the shots. And really Greece is just having to follow orders, as it were. It's now pretty certain, I think, that Mr. Papandreou will win this confidence vote and push through these fresh austerity measures. If that doesn't happen, then I think a lot of observers would say the results would be fairly catastrophic, because the risk of contagion of this spreading to other countries would increase dramatically then.
Tim Friend live there in Athens for us. Thanks, Tim. Well, Nick Skrekos is an economic analyst. He's been closely following the crisis in Greece and believes a second bailout isn't the answer.
The fact is that adding more debt to a country that has too much debt is not going to solve things. Currently, Greece has a debt to GDP ratio of about 160%, and that's going to keep going up with the bailouts, when we know that any economic reality tells us that above 80% is very, very dangerous, and you are very highly likely not to be able to pay things back. Well, I'm not sure that Greece has actually negotiated very effectively with the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission. I think now that we have a new Minister for Finance, things may improve a little bit, but I think they must understand in their own best interests that if they want to keep the Eurozone together, if they want to prevent the European banks from suffering harsh pain, if they want to avoid a Greek banking system collapse which would hurt all of the Balkans, if they want to avoid an event, a credit event for credit default swaps, that they need to sit down and reconsider some of the things that they're proposing, because a lot of these measures are part of what was called 50 years ago the Washington Consensus, and have been applied in many countries by the IMF, and yet in very few cases have we ever had positive results. Now, reason tells us if you keep banging your head against the wall, maybe you should take a step back and rethink.
And a sign of just how much global concern there is about the Greek debt crisis. We're hearing that the G7 finance ministers are currently holding a phone conference to discuss the situation in Greece. More on that, of course, as we get it. Now, anti-war protesters here in London are mourning one of their most memorable colleagues. Brian Hall shot to fame for camping outside the UK Parliament in his bid to end the British and American presence in Iraq. We're going to be looking back at his life.